Hey folks, welcome back to week 11 in visual design. This is part 2, our second online lecture for the week. Last time we covered some drawing in Illustrator, focusing squarely on the pencil tool. This time we're going to move on over to the pen tool and see how that works. All right, so I'm going to get right back to it, hop right over to Illustrator here. Remember that in the week 11 folder, there is this handout here, Drawing Basics. Be sure to take advantage of that. There's all sorts of great tutorials in there as well. So certainly take advantage of that. But back to week 11. Again, today we're going to deal with the pen tool. So hopefully you've taken a couple of days to really practice with the pencil tool, try drawing some things, or just messing around with it. All right, so back to Illustrator. If you remember, the pen tool is over here in the toolbox, 3 tools down from the top. Looks like one of those metal nib pens. Okay, so when you choose the pen tool, you'll see that your cursor replicates the icon that is in the toolbox. Looks like the little nib pen. And it works pretty straightforward. Unlike the pencil tool where you just sort of draw freehand and the line is created as you draw, the pen tool requires a little more precision. So the first thing you do with the pen tool is simply choose anywhere on the screen you want and click once. And what that does is it drops an anchor point into the grid. Again, the analogy I've used before is like putting a pin in a pin board. So it's like we dropped a pin into a pegboard or a pin board. And now you'll see that as I'm moving my mouse around, there's sort of a blue wire that's sort of being pulled out from that pin, from that anchor point. And so this allows me to direct the line or the wire in any direction that I want. So if I click a second time, boom, I drop another anchor and it draws a line. A third time, boom, fourth, boom, 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 and so on and so forth. And what I'm doing is essentially creating whatever shape I want from a variety of straight lines that I am just continuing from one anchor to the next anchor and so on and so forth. Now, if I want to go back to the beginning where I started, you remember with the pencil tool, you just sort of scribbled and drew and it didn't really come to an end. Here, like rectangles and polygons and stars, we can actually make this a closed shape. How do I do that? Well, if I bring my cursor close to the first anchor point that I put down, you'll see that as I hover over that very first anchor point, a little circle pops up in the lower right corner of the pen tool. This tells me that I am back at the very beginning. If I click here, it then closes the shape. Now, once I'm done drawing it, go back to your black selection arrow, and it's a finished shape. I can pick it up, I can move it around, I can spin it, I can resize it, I can do all those things that you could do with other shapes. And unlike the pencil tool, closed shapes made with the pen tool are good for filling with color. So for example, if I do what I did before, I'll swap the stroke with the fill color. It now becomes a nice finished shape. Now at this point you can probably guess what's going to happen next, right? If I click off of the shape with the black selection arrow and then go back to the direct selection tool, which is the white arrow, and then hover over where there's an anchor point, I can change what the shape looks like, just like I could with the rectangle or the polygon or any of those other tools. You'll see that at sharp corners there is this rounding ball. So if I pull that, I can start to round corners, right? And they pop up in certain places. They don't pop up everywhere, but they pop up where Illustrator feels they are needed. As you can see, there are others, right? I can make the entire shape round if I want, or I can make the entire shape back to being sharp and move it around and so on and so forth. So at this point, it acts just like any other geometric shape. It just so happens that it's this bizarre shape that I made as opposed to some recognizable shape. So if you think about that, the pen tool really allows you to sort of draw anything you want. Now, when I'm drawing around here, you'll notice that these purple smart guides are popping up. That sort of helps tell me where I am in relation to things. So for example, if I want my next anchor point to line up perfectly with the first anchor point, as I start to drag it out, you'll see that not only is it telling me that I'm making a perfectly horizontal line, but as I get underneath that anchor point, boom, it tells me, hey, you've lined up with it perfectly, and then click, and then click. So you can really make some nicely designed closed shapes this way. So the easiest way to think of the pen tool right out of the gate is that it is a collection of straight lines that as you click around creates a shape made up of a bunch of straight lines. In this way, it's very similar to the polygonal lasso tool that we used in Photoshop to make selections, right? A collection of small straight lines that you can then turn into something else. Now I'm just making strange little unrecognizable shapes, but of course if you put some thought into this, you could probably draw something that is a little more recognizable, that somebody might identify as something a little more obvious, like this perhaps. Now you'll notice that I'm drawing with the fill on, which you can certainly do, but it makes more sense to draw with it off. I just sort of forgot to turn it off. But anyway, you get the idea. Oh, look, it's a car from the 1970s. Okay, anyway, moving on. So you can draw pretty much anything you can possibly think of using the pen tool, so long as you can make it up of a collection of straight lines. Now, that being said, you can also make curved lines with the pen tool. How do we do that? Well, similar idea. You grab the pen tool, and you click once to establish an anchor point, and you, again, I've got this sort of free floating wire. But instead of just clicking a second time to put in a second anchor point and make a straight line, I am going to click and drag, which establishes a curved line. Now the curved line, I can basically, before I lift up on the mouse button, I can put it however I want it. It can be a lower curve or an upper curve. It can be a pointy curve. It can be a gentle curve. You name it, whatever you want to do. So I can do that. You'll notice that I'm pulling out these handles, right? We saw those earlier when we were using the pencil tool. Now when I let go of the pen tool, it goes ahead and makes the curve. Now, if I go to make the next line, you'll see that it automatically assumes that I want the next line to be a curve. If I'm above this handle, it's an upward curve. If I go below this handle, it turns into a downward curve. And if I'm perfectly in line with the handle, it's a straight line. So again, above the handle, upward curve. Below the handle, lower curve. And in line with the handle, perfectly straight line. So those handles kind of tell you everything. So if I wanted to continue in this direction, I could do that, click, and then again, drag it again, and then continue, drag, continue, drag, and then I'm going to go back to the beginning. Again, remember that little circle tells me I'm at the beginning, and then drag that out. And now I've made more of a rounded, amorphic looking shape, right? As opposed to something made up of a bunch of straight lines, it's now a nice rounded shape, which if I go to the direct selection tool and hover over an anchor point, you can see that those adjustment bars are there. And so I can readjust the angle any way that I want. If I wanted to, I could pick up the anchor point and simply reshape it. Grab this anchor point, reshape it. Grab that handle, reshape it. So it's all completely malleable. So the pen tool allows you to do either straight lines by simply dropping an anchor, clicking, dropping another anchor, and so on and so forth, like this. Click, 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 click all the way around. Or you can draw curved lines like this one by clicking and dragging your way around. Now, I will say that the pen tool requires a lot of practice. Unlike the pencil tool, which is fairly instinctual, you're just sort of drawing with your mouse or your finger or your light pen. The pen tool requires a little more practice. Drawing with the straight lines is probably easier because it's pretty easy to understand the idea of anchor point line, and so on and so forth. Drawing with curved lines requires a lot more practice because they're a little harder to control. But the more you practice with them, the better you will get at it for sure. And even if it doesn't come out perfect, remember you can always go back to the direct selection tool and make some adjustments after the fact by simply fine-tuning it using the collection of anchors and adjustment handles. So it's not really locked in stone. And of course, like the pencil tool, if you have something that is made up of a line, like these, and it just has a stroke color but no fill color. You can then affect the way it looks by simply going over to the stroke palette and making adjustments. I can change the width of the stroke. I can make it a dashed line if I wanted to. I can add arrows to it if it had an end point, but since these are closed shapes, the arrows don't really do you a lot of good. But I could, of course, change the personality of the line. Instead of being just a single width all the way around, a uniform width, I could change that this way, make it more of a thick and thin line. So the stroke palette works exactly the same on lines created by the pen tool as it does on lines created by the pencil tool. Okay, now what I want you to do is to practice with the pencil tool and the pen tool until you're really comfortable with it. And then we are going to get into our practice images and we are going to do some tracing. I'm going to show you how to do that. Okay, so when you're ready to move on to actually tracing something and drawing something more recognizable, when you feel a little comfortable with the pencil tool and the pen tool, come over to the week 11 folder, which again you can find in Files under week 11. And there's a folder that says Practice Images, and inside there are these 3 practice images. Let's take a look at them up close. Now, in sort of ascending order of difficulty, the first one is an ice cream cone, right? It's made up of really simple shapes. There's a circle, and then these curved lines, and then of course the X's and whatnot. Then this one here is a Day of the Dead mask, which, forgetting about the texture on the lines, is also made up of relatively simple shapes. And then the last one, which is more complicated, is this Mandela circle pattern here. This is made up of a whole bunch of completed connecting shapes, so certainly definitely more complicated. So what I want you to do is start with the ice cream cone and try to trace it as best you can using the tools we've learned so far. Now that includes the shape tools, because of course the cherry on top here is just a circle, so don't try to draw that freehand, just make a circle. Then you can draw over that. Now how do we do this? Well, let me show you how you get them into Illustrator, and we can go from there. So remember, they're in the week 11 folder under practice images. Make sure you download them to your computer so that we can put them into Illustrator more easily. Okay, what do we do next? So you're in Illustrator, you have a blank piece of paper you're working on. The size doesn't particularly matter. And this is where we're going to use the layers palette. You know, you've probably noticed by now we use the layers palette in Illustrator much less than we do in Photoshop. But this is a good opportunity to use the layers palette. So it just has the one layer by default, and we're going to place one of our practice images on the page. Now, if you go to File, and then you go down to Place, and then the keyboard command for that is Shift Command P or Shift Control P, depending if you're on a Mac or a PC. You hit Place, and then that allows you to navigate to where you have saved those practice images. I'm going to grab mine right here, go to my week 11 folder, and there's my practice images. So I'm going to grab the ice cream cone, right? Grab this one here, and I'm going to hit Place. And what it does is it loads that image onto your cursor. See how it's floating around with my cursor? And then I can go ahead and click anywhere, and it will drop the image onto the page. Now, it's enormous. It's way too big, but that's okay. We're going to shrink it down, and you'll be able to do this because you're familiar with how to do this stuff in Photoshop. So grab your zoom tool, and of course the option key will allow you to zoom backwards so that you can see your image completely. I go back up to the the black selection arrow. And the X through the middle of it means that the image is here in your Illustrator file, but it's not embedded into the file. So we want to embed it. So if you go to your Properties panel, remember the Properties panel is like that golf caddy panel that has everything we need when we select certain items. With your image selected, go over and click on the Embed button, and that will actually embed the image right into your file. So now this way you can't lose it, basically. All right, next we can fold up the Properties palette. We're going to want to shrink down this image. Make sure you're holding down the Shift key when you do so you don't squish it, and shrink it down to a size that you can actually get it onto your piece of paper. And then we can go back in. Okay, now this is what we're going to trace, but we're not going to work on the same layer, because if we started to draw over this, there's a possibility we could accidentally pick up the picture and move it while we're trying to trace it. You know, it's the same sort of idea as if you had a piece of tracing paper over something you were tracing and you didn't tape it down first. So we're going to do sort of the digital equivalent of taping this down. To do that, go over to the Layers panel, and we're going to simply double-click on the thumbnail of this particular layer, and this opens up the Layer Options panel. And there's just a button that says Template. We just want to check this off. And what it will do is it locks the image in place so it won't move, and it also dims the image to about 50%. Now if you want to, you can play around with these settings, and if you want to make it lighter or darker, you can do that simply by double-clicking back on the thumbnail anytime you want to get to the layer options. You could name the layer too, which I always recommend, although naming layers in this particular instance isn't quite as important as it usually is, but it's never a bad idea. So we can simply put cone template so I know what it is, and then hit OK, and you'll see over here in the layers palette it puts a lock on it. There's a little graphic of a lock so it can't move anywhere. It has turned the name into an italicized font, so that shows you that it's a template. And then if I go back over here, you'll see that it's grayed out a little bit, and I can't move it. I can't do anything to it. So now it's traceable. I can trace over this. Now before I trace it, of course, I'm going to need another layer. So I'm going to go down to the bottom of the Layers palette and click on the Create New Layer button, and that'll give me a new layer. And you can name that simply by double-clicking on the name Layer 2, and we'll call it Traced Cone or whatever you would like. Then hit Return on your keyboard. So now I have a regular layer that I can draw on, and then I have my template layer that's locked in place. Make sure you've chosen the layer on top, and now we can zoom in a little more. And so what you're going to do is, using the tools that you've learned so far, the shape tools, the pencil tool, and the pen tool, you're going to try tracing this to the best of your ability. You want to try to make as many closed shapes as possible so that when you fill them with color, they work. But of course, not everything is a closed shape. This curve, this curve, this curve, these X's, they're just lines. Those aren't closed shapes at all. So you can sort of use your own judgment to decide what needs to be a closed shape and what does not. But the ice cream, for example, on top of this cone, I probably want that to be a certain color. So make sure you close it. Now that means using your imagination in some spots, because I can't see what the ice cream looks like behind the cherry. So you have to just sort of use your imagination to fill in those areas. So how would I do this? Well, I'm just going to demonstrate this one. So if I grab the ellipse tool, now you'll notice here that I have no color in the fill or the stroke. Make sure you put a color in the stroke only. What I usually tell people is, to make your life easier so you can really see the lines you're drawing, you're probably better off picking a really loud color that you can change later. Even though I don't want my ice cream cone to be all drawn in red, I'm going to draw it in red just so I can see it better. Okay, so first things first, I'm going to draw a circle and try to get it to be about the right size. Line that up, boom, let that go. And then remember, once you've drawn something, go back to the black selection arrow, deselect it. Now that's locked in place. So there's my circle for the cherry. And remember, later on, I can always go back and change the stroke weight, but I'm not dealing with that right now. Okay, next I want to draw the stem. So I'm going to grab the pen tool, and we're going to start here and try to draw the stroke around this stem of the cherry the best we can. Okay, now if you finish drawing a line and with the pen tool and you don't want to reconnect it, and you just want it to remain a line, then you have to sort of shut this off. The easiest way to do that is either to command click, and that disconnects it, or you can hit the escape button on your keyboard twice. Either one will work. So now that line is in place. Next, now I'm going to draw this oval over here. Now I want this to be a completed oval, so I'm going to grab the ellipse tool. And this one's going to be a little tough because it's at an angle, but first I'm going to draw the ellipse, and I'm going to kind of estimate roughly how big I think it is. So there you go. And then go back to my selection arrow, and I can pick it up and bring it roughly to where it belongs, and then I can rotate it so that it's in place, and then I can use the arrow keys on my keyboard to kind of knock it into place a little bit. And this might require a little finagling to get it exactly where you want it. So now I can make it a little bigger, There you go. So now I've got that too. Now notice that as we're drawing these, I'll go over to the layers panel. These sub-layers are starting to pop up, right? There's the ellipse I just created, boom, right? There's that path. There's the circle for the cherry. You can name these if you want, depending on how detailed you really want to get. So I can name that cherry, cherry stem, cherry stem base. Now you don't have to name all the sublayers, but I'm just showing you that you can, and it helps you keep organized. Also, you can rearrange their order, right? You want to try to draw from the back to the front, but that doesn't always work. So for example, the cherry stem base should be behind the cherry stem, so I can simply pick it up and relocate it. So now it's in the right order. Okay, so back to drawing. Again, click off so that it's disconnected. Grab the pen tool, and now I'm going to make the ice cream itself. I'm going to start over here somewhere behind the cherry and start to make the curves that make up the shape of the ice cream. And remember, if you don't quite get it right the first time, you can always go back and adjust it afterwards using the direct selection tool. And be patient with yourself. This is not an easy thing to do. That's why we're starting out with something fairly simple like the ice cream cone, and then working our way up. Okay, now this is what I was talking about in terms of having your imagination, because I just need to connect these two to make the ice cream a finished shape. So I'm just going to draw a straight line. It's going to be behind the cherry anyway. It won't matter. All right, so that takes care of the ice cream. Then I'm going to do these curves. Grab the pen tool, click, click, drag. And again, option click to disconnect it. Click, click, drag. Option click to disconnect it. Click. Now this one's a really big curve, so I'm not going to be able to get from the beginning all the way to the end. So I'm going to go about halfway and do that, and then continue it down to the end. It's just too big of a curve to do in one swoop. Okay. Now, as you're drawing along, one thing you might want to do is go over to the Layers palette and shut off the view for the template. So meaning if I shut this off, that goes away and I can sort of see the ice cream cone. Now you can see I've got stuff to fix. I have a dent over here. This is a little crooked. And obviously the line weight is not correct. It's too thin, but it gives me a place to start. Later on, I can always go back and, thicken up the line weight on everything to whatever I want it to be. I can round things out so they look a little better. And I can go in with the direct selection tool and clean things up a little bit. I can move this guy here and adjust the roundness a little bit, adjust that here so it looks better, and so on and so forth. So it's going to take some fine tuning. Now, like I said, even though these look fairly simple, it definitely requires a lot of patience. So first practice with the pen tool and the pencil tool for a while, and then you can sort of go from there. And remember, you can also use the pencil tool, like I said, if I wanted to. I can draw some of this freehand, but you decide how comfortable you are with it. Okay, so what I want you to do is to do your best tracing the ice cream cone. When you're totally happy with it and you think you've mastered those skills, move on to the skull. And then once you've done that, move on to the mandala. Practice, practice, and do your best. All right, I'll talk to you guys soon.